check was already filled out when my brother slid it across my mother's kitchen table, and all he wanted was my signature underneath the part that said I surrendered every claim to the cottage. When I set the pen down and said no, my mother reached over and slapped me hard enough that my coffee mug rattled in its saucer, and she hissed that I'd lost the right to argue the day I abandoned this family. That was the exact moment our lawyer, Mr. Okafor, quietly clicked his pen shut, looked straight at her, and asked, "Do you understand who you just laid hands on?" The whole room went dead silent. My name is Hazel. I'm 29, and for most of my life, my family treated me like the spare set of keys nobody can quite remember why they kept. I work as a forensic accountant in Toronto. I spend my days pulling apart shell companies and tracing money that people very much do not want traced. I'm good at it. I'm the person the Crown calls when a numbered Ontario corporation turns out to be a laundromat for somebody's drug money, but nothing in 12 years of that work prepared me for what I found rotting inside my own family. Before I tell you how that kitchen erupted and how I took apart their tidy little lives one wire transfer at a time, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to draw a hard line with relatives who thought your kindness was just weakness with a slower fuse. Hit that like button for me. The cottage sat on Lake of Bays up in Muskoka, and my grandmother had bought it in 1971 with money she earned cleaning houses in Rosedale. She raised 4 kids in a bungalow in Scarborough and saved every spare dollar for that strip of shoreline because it was the one place she ever felt like she owned a piece of the world. I was the only grandchild who ever went up there with her. While my brother Reed was off at hockey tournaments and my mother was hosting her bridge nights, I was the one in the canoe at 6 in the morning helping Gran check the dock for rot. She taught me how to split kindling, how to read the weather coming over the far ridge, how to balance a checkbook to the penny. When she got sick, I was the one who drove up Highway 11 every second weekend through that whole brutal winter, sleeping on the pull-out couch so she wouldn't be alone. My mother came up twice. Reed came up never. Gran passed in late October, just after the leaves turned. The funeral was at a little United Church in Huntsville, and my mother spent the entire reception telling people how devastated she was, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that never seemed to get wet. Reed wore a suit that cost more than Gran's monthly pension and spent the whole time on his phone in the parking lot. I sat at the back with Gran's old neighbor, a man named Mr. Eat Tremblay, who'd plowed her driveway for 30 winters, and the two of us were the only people in that room who actually cried. A week later, my mother called and said we needed to settle the estate paperwork at her place in Oakville. She said it like it was nothing, a formality, the kind of thing you sign and forget. But I know what people sound like when they're hiding the real reason for a meeting. I've sat across the table from enough liars to recognize the rehearsed casualness in someone's voice. So I called Mr. Okafor, the lawyer Gran had hired years ago to write her will, and I asked him to come. My mother didn't know he'd be there. That was the first card I kept face down. When I arrived, the check was already on the table. Reed had filled it out himself, a number with too few zeros to mean anything real, made out to me, sitting on top of a transfer deed that would sign the entire Muskoka property over to Reed and Associates Holdings, whatever fiction that was. My mother poured me a coffee like we were about to have a pleasant afternoon. My brother leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been told no and meant it. "It's the simplest thing," Reed said. "You take the check, you sign the deed, the cottage comes to me. You don't even use the place anymore." Which was a lie, and he knew it was a lie because I'd been up there in September closing the water lines for the season while he was in Cabo. I picked up the deed and read it the way I read everything, slowly, all the way to the fine print, because the fine print is where people bury their crimes, and there it was. The deed didn't just transfer Gran's cottage. It bundled in a release that would have dissolved my entire share of her estate, every account, every bond, the whole thing, in exchange for a check that would barely cover the land transfer tax they were asking me to sell. They were asking me to disappear quietly with a thank you note. I'm not signing this, I said. I kept my voice flat. I learned a long time ago that the calmer I get, the more it unsettles them, because they've spent my whole life trying to provoke the crying, pleading version of me they can dismiss. Gran left the cottage to me. She put it in writing. You both know she did. That's when the temperature in the room dropped. My mother set down the coffee pot and stood up, and I watched her face go through that familiar transformation, the country club composure peeling back to show the thing underneath it. Don't you dare, she said. Your grandmother was confused at the end. You manipulated a sick old woman. You sat up there poisoning her against her own daughter, against your brother, and now you want to walk away with everything. Her voice climbed. You have always been jealous. You've always been cold. Reed has a family to think about, a business, a reputation in this city. What are you going to do with a cottage? Sit up there alone with your calculator? You don't belong in that family. You never did. I'd heard versions of that speech my entire life. I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who went and got a degree in something nobody at her dinner parties understood instead of marrying well. Reed was the golden boy who could do no wrong, even when the wrongs piled up like snow against a door. I set the deed back down and slid it away from me across the table. I'm not funding whatever Reed's doing, I said. I earned Gran's trust. I'm keeping the cottage. The slap came before I saw her arm move. Her hand cracked across the left side of my face and snapped my head sideways, and the heat of it bloomed up my cheek into my ear, which started ringing that high, thin note. The coffee mug jumped. I tasted copper where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. For a second, nobody breathed. You do not get a choice in this, my mother screamed, and every ounce of the refined Oakville matron was gone now, just raw ugliness left. You will sign that paper. You've been an embarrassment to this family since the day you decided you were better than us, and I will not let you ruin your brother's future out of spite. Sign it, or I will make sure you have nothing and no one. Reed hadn't moved. He sat there with that little curl at the corner of his mouth, looking at me the way you'd look at a problem that was about to solve itself. The room felt airless. But they'd forgotten something. They'd been so busy enjoying the old reflex of pushing me around that they genuinely stopped seeing the fourth person in the room. Mr. O'Coffer had been sitting silently by the window the whole time, a leather folio resting on his knees. He rose now, unhurried, the way he did everything, and adjusted his glasses and looked directly at my mother. His voice was soft, which somehow made it land harder. Mrs. Lindgren, he said, I want to make certain you understand who you just struck. My mother spun toward him, flustered and furious. I struck my ungrateful daughter. This is a private family matter. And frankly, I don't know why you're here. Just prepare the transfer like Reed asked. Mr. O'Coffer didn't blink. He opened the folio and slid out a thick document bound in navy, embossed with a seal at the corner. This is not a private family matter, he said, and she is not simply your daughter. You are standing in a room with the sole beneficiary of the Margaret Whitfield Family Trust, the controlling interest of which includes the property your son is attempting to acquire, along with assets your son does not appear to know exist. The whole room froze in a thick, suffocating silence. My father. They're divorced now, but he'd come for the meeting smelling money the way he always does, let out a short, ugly laugh from the doorway. You've got the wrong file, Counsel, he said, or Margaret was off her head at the end. Hazel running anything? Look at her. She does bookkeeping for the government. I don't do bookkeeping, I said quietly. I find money people are trying to hide. I'm very good at it. Mr. O'Coffer laid out the truth in that flat lawyer's cadence while my family stood there with their mouths slightly open. Gran hadn't just left me the cottage. She'd spent the last 3 years of her life with my help and the help of a financial advisor she trusted, consolidating everything into a trust with exactly one beneficiary. Not because she wanted to punish anyone, but because she'd seen what was coming. She'd watched Reed borrow against her name twice and never pay it back. She'd watched my mother quietly remortgage the Scarborough house, the house Gran had bought, and gamble the equity on Reed's business ventures. Gran was poor for most of her life, and she was nobody's fool. She knew the only person in this family who would protect what she built was the granddaughter who slept on her couch. Reed finally found his voice. "This is insane. Whatever she told you, she was sick. She didn't. Your grandmother passed a capacity assessment 3 separate times, Mr. Okafor said, documented by her family physician and an independent geriatric specialist at her own insistence. She anticipated this exact conversation." He let that sit. "She also asked me to give you something, Hazel, if it came to this." He handed me an envelope. I didn't open it then. I slid it into my bag because I knew if I read my grandmother's handwriting in that kitchen, I would come apart, and I refused to give them the satisfaction. I should have left it there. A smarter person, a kinder person, would have taken the cottage and the trust and walked away and let these people drown in their own choices. But I'd just been slapped in my mother's kitchen at 29 years old, and something in me went very cold and very clear. Reed had filled out that check from a checkbook with a business name I didn't recognize. Reed and Associates Holdings. In my line of work, an unfamiliar holding company on a family member's checkbook is not a curiosity. It's a thread. And I pull threads for a living. That night, back in my condo with the lake effect snow ticking against the windows, I opened my laptop and started pulling. It took me less time than I'd like to admit. Reed had built himself a little empire of appearances, a consulting firm that supposedly advised high net worth families on legacy wealth, which is a phrase that means absolutely nothing and is exactly the kind of phrase con men love. He had a slick website, a downtown office with his name on a glass door, a Range Rover, a membership at a golf club in King City. What he did not have, as far as I could find, in 3 nights of digging through corporate registries and the public filings he was legally required to make, and conveniently hadn't, was a single real client whose money was where he claimed it was. Because Reed wasn't advising families on their legacy wealth, he was taking it. He'd convinced a half-dozen older, trusting people, 2 of them friends of my mother's from that same Oakville circle, one of them Gran's old bridge partner, for God's sake, to let him manage their retirement savings. He showed them statements every quarter with healthy little gains penciled in. The statements were fiction. The money wasn't invested in anything. He'd moved it through Reed and Associates into his own accounts, paid the earlier investors small returns out of the newer investors' deposits to keep everyone calm, and spent the rest on the Range Rover and the golf club and the deposit on a place in Collingwood. It's the oldest fraud there is. A man named Ponzi gave it his name 100 years ago, and people still fall for it because the lie wears such a nice suit. And the reason, the real reason. They needed Gran's cottage so badly. The reason for the check and the slap and the whole performance was that Reed's house of cards was 3 or 4 months from collapsing. One of his investors had started asking pointed questions about a withdrawal. Reed needed a hard asset, something with real value, something he could borrow against fast and quietly to plug the hole before the questions turned into phone calls to the OSC. Gran's cottage, free and clear and worth well over $1 million now that Muskoka had gone insane, was the lifeboat. I wasn't refusing to sign a deed. I was refusing to bail out a sinking fraud, and they were terrified. I printed everything. I built a timeline the way I would for any file, clean sourced, dated. And then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the Ontario Securities Commission, where it turns out I know a couple of people from a joint file years back. The second was to a former colleague who'd left to do exactly this kind of work for the RCMP's Financial Crime Unit. I didn't accuse. I don't accuse. I just laid the documents on the table and let the numbers say what numbers say, which is everything. While I was doing that, my family did what I knew they'd do, because people in a panic are predictable. My mother went to war the only way she knew how. Socially. She got on the phone to every woman in her circle and rewrote the story. I was the cold, scheming daughter who had isolated a dying woman and stolen her estate. I had hired shady lawyers. I had bullied my poor brother. She told it well. She always could. For about 2 weeks, I'd run into people who looked at me like I'd done something unspeakable. My mother's best friend crossed the street outside the LC Bow to avoid me. I let it happen. Every story she told was another witness who would remember, later, exactly how hard she'd worked to bury me. Reed's part was to lawyer up. I got a letter on heavy stationery threatening to contest the trust on grounds of undue influence, demanding I return what I'd manipulated Gran into giving me. It was bluster. Empty. A man drowning will grab at anything, even a lawyer he can't afford to pay. I forwarded the letter to Mr. Okafor, who replied to Reed's counsel with the 3 capacity assessments and a polite note suggesting they reconsider. The threat stopped within a week. The investigation did not. The thing about financial fraud is that once it cracks all at once. Like ice going out on a lake in spring. There's a long, quiet winter where nothing seems to be happening, and then in the space of a single warm afternoon, the whole frozen surface heaves and breaks and starts moving, and you cannot stop it or slow it or put it back. It went public on a Thursday in February. My mother, in a final swing for sympathy, had decided to throw a 60th birthday party for herself at the golf club in King City, Reed's Golf Club, which I suspect Reed hadn't paid the dues on in months. The whole circle was there. The friends, the rivals, the bridge ladies, the husbands who sat on hospital boards and ran development companies. My mother in a new dress, holding court, the wronged matriarch who'd kept her chin up through her terrible daughter's betrayal. Reed in the corner, working the room, shaking hands, no doubt sniffing for the next mark. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I heard about it the way the whole city heard about it. Because that same Thursday, the OSC issued a freeze order and a public notice naming Reed and Associates Holdings and identifying my brother as the subject of an active investigation into investment fraud. The notice hit the financial press the way those notices do. Small at first, a paragraph on a regulatory blog, and then picked up, and then everywhere. And the people in that room at the golf club, the wealthy, connected, deeply networked people my mother had spent 2 weeks telling her sob story to, were the same people who got the alert on their phones. Some of them were the actual victims. One of them, Gran's old Birch partner, was a widow named Mrs. Castellano who had put her entire late husband's pension into Reed's fund. I'm told the room turned the way weather turns. 1 minute, my mother was being toasted, and the next there were phones lighting up all over the dining room and people leaning into each other, and a particular kind of silence spreading from table to table. Mrs. Castellano, 81 years old, stood up in the middle of my mother's birthday and asked Reed in front of everyone where her money was. And Reed, who had a story for everything, who'd talked his way out of every consequence his entire charmed life, opened his mouth and had nothing. The husbands who ran companies were already calling their own lawyers. One of them, a man who'd lost $250,000, told Reed he'd see him in a courtroom and possibly a prison. My mother stood there in her new dress, while the story she'd worked so hard to tell about me dissolved in real time and the real story. Her son, the fraud, her own complicity in propping him up, rose up to take its place in front of everyone whose opinion she'd ever cared about. She called me that night 11 times. I let it go to voicemail. The messages went from rage to bargaining to something close to begging. She said she was my mother. She said family forgives. She said I was the only one who could fix this. That I knew people, that I could make the investigation go away if I just told them it was all a misunderstanding. As if I'd built it. As if the lie was mine to unbuild. I want to be honest about something because the comments on stories like this always ask why the woman doesn't just press charges, doesn't call the police, doesn't fight harder. I did. The day after that meeting in the kitchen, I went to the Holton police and I made a statement about the assault, and I gave them Mr. Okafor's name as a witness because he'd seen the whole thing. My mother was charged. Not with anything that would put her in a cell. It was a first offense. She's a woman in her 60s with no record. But it went on paper. It went on the record. And for a woman whose entire identity was built on appearances, the public fact of it was its own kind of sentence. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because the version of me that absorbed a slap and stayed quiet had died in that kitchen, and I wasn't going to resurrect her. Reed is awaiting trial. The OSC and the RCMP took it from there. It's out of my hands and into the slow grinding machinery of the courts, which is exactly where it belongs. He'll likely lose the office, the Range Rover, the King City membership, and depending on how the sentencing goes, a few years of his freedom. The victims will get back a fraction, maybe eventually. That's the part that doesn't have a clean ending. Old people who trusted a smiling man lost savings they can't earn back at their age. That's the real cost of what my brother is, and no headline about his downfall makes Mrs. Castellano whole. The cottage is mine. I went up in April when the lake was still half ice and the road was a mess of mud, and I sat on Grand's dock with a thermos of coffee and finally opened the envelope Mr. Okafor had given me. It was short. Gran wasn't a woman of many words. She wrote that she knew what they'd try to do, and she was sorry it would fall on me and that the cottage wasn't a reward for being the good one. She didn't believe in good ones and bad ones. It was just the one thing she was sure I protect, because protecting things I loved was the only thing she'd ever seen me do without being asked. She wrote that she hoped I'd let people up there who deserved it, and that I'd stop sleeping on the pullout and finally take the good bedroom. And she signed it the way she always signed her notes to me, with my name and then hers, like we were just two people who'd worked something out between us. I cried then. There was no one to perform calm for, so I let it go, sitting on the cold dock in the April wind. People say family is forever, that blood is thicker than everything, that you owe the people who raised you an endless line of credit they can draw on no matter what they do. I used to believe a version of that. I used to think that if I just gave enough, stayed quiet enough, made myself small enough to fit the shape they'd assigned me, they'd eventually decide I was worth something. But you can't earn your way into being loved by people who've already decided you're a resource to be used. No amount of kindness buys respect from someone who only respects what they can take. The hardest thing I ever did was stop. Stop explaining. Stop apologizing. Stop picking up the phone. The cruelest punishment I could possibly hand my mother and my brother wasn't the police statement or the investigation. It was simply removing myself, completely, and letting them stand in the wreckage of choices that were entirely their own. The silence after I stopped answering wasn't lonely. It was the quietest, cleanest, most enormous relief I have ever felt. I'm 30 next month. I've got a chosen family now, friends who show up, a partner who thinks what I do for a living is the most interesting thing in the world, Mr. Tremblay, who still plows the cottage road and won't take $1 for it. I split my own kindling. I read the weather coming over the far ridge the way Gran taught me, and on the good mornings, I take the canoe out before the lake wakes up. And I think about how she spent 50 years building something out of nothing so that one of us would be free, and I am. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you just to find out who you actually are? Tell me your story in the comments. And if this one meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. I've got more of them, and not all of them end this gently. I keep coming back to one small fact. My grandmother cleaned other people's houses for 50 years so that one of us could be free, and the only thing she asked in return was that someone in this family be willing to protect what she built. That's the thread that runs under everything that happened. Reed didn't fall because the universe punished him. He fell because of what he was, a man who took an 81-year-old widow's pension and spent it on a Range Rover, who built a business out of a smile and a lie. My mother didn't lose her standing at that golf club because of me. She lost it because she spent 2 weeks telling a story she knew was false to the very people her son had robbed. Cause and effect. You plant rot, and one spring the whole frozen surface heaves and breaks, and there's nothing you can do to put it back. I used to think being good meant being quiet, swallowing the slap, absorbing the insult, making myself small enough to fit the shape they'd assigned me. I was wrong about that for almost 30 years. There's a difference between being decent and being a doormat, and the line between them is whether you're willing to tell the truth even when the truth costs you the people you came from. I didn't pull Reed's records out of spite. I pulled them because I'd spent my whole career learning that numbers don't lie even when families do. And once I saw what he'd done to Mrs. Castellano, looking away would have made me complicit. Knowing how to read a deed, how to trace a wire transfer, how to stay calm enough to keep face cards face down, that's not a cold thing. It's the most loving thing my grandmother ever taught me, sitting at her kitchen table balancing a checkbook to the penny. And the hardest part wasn't the investigation or the police statement. It was the stopping, letting 11 calls go to voicemail, sitting on a cold dock in April and not picking up, refusing to set myself on fire one more time to keep people warm who'd never once warmed me. That took something I didn't know I had until that slap woke it up. The steadiness to hold a boundary while someone you love screams that you're heartless for having one. If you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Be the kind of person who tells the truth even to the people who raised you. Learn your craft so well that no one can lie to you about the thing you understand best. And when the moment comes to walk away from people who only ever saw you as a resource, find the nerve to actually do it, and then forgive yourself for the relief you feel afterward. The quiet that came after I stopped answering wasn't loneliness. It was the cleanest air I've ever breathed, and I think Gran knew it was waiting for me all along.